Hello everyone, very warm welcome to the Modern Slavery PEC event on the role of consumers in addressing modern slavery. Many thanks for being here. It's good to see so many of you interested in the role of consumers and in our own role in engaging them effectively. My name is Jakub Sobik. I'm a communications director at the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Center, which is hosting the event. For those who are not familiar with us, the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Center, or Modern Slavery PEC for short, was created by the investment of public funding to enhance the understanding of modern slavery and transform the effectiveness of law and policies designed to address it. So we commission and co-create research with a focus on impact on policy and practice. And we bring together academics, policymakers, businesses, civil society, survivors, and the public to collaborate on solving this global challenge. We are a consortium of 6 academic organizations led by the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law, and we are funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council on behalf of UK Research and Innovation. So today we will discuss various aspects of the role of consumers in addressing modern slavery, and the basis for the discussion will be the report that we published back in October. It was entitled Addressing Consumer Awareness and Inaction Towards Modern Slavery. It was developed by a collaboration of researchers from Royal Holloway University of London, University of Glasgow, and University of Melbourne. We'll have the researchers from the research team speaking today, and we'll post the links to the report, the summary, and a short guidance for practitioners based on research here in the chat. So look out for that. Just to say, if you use Twitter, please use the Consumers Modern Slavery hashtag. Feel free to tag us in your tweets. We are at Slavery PEC. Just to let you know, we are recording this event. We will publish the video on YouTube, on our YouTube channel and on our website later on, so that everyone will have a chance to watch it afterwards. We will have a Q&A session at the end. Everyone will be able to ask questions, both via the chat function and by video. And I just wanted to go briefly through what's going to happen today. In a while, we'll welcome Dame Sara Thornton, who is the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, who will open the event with her remarks. We'll then welcome Professor Deirdre Shaw from the University of Glasgow, who will present the key findings from the research that has given the basis for this discussion today. And then we move on to the panel discussion. We'll have Barber, who's the author of the book entitled Consumed: The Need for Collective Change, Colonialism, Climate Change and Consumerism. We'll have Ryna Sherazi, who is the head of fundraising and communications at Anti-Slavery International, and Professor Andreas Chassidakis from the Royal Holloway University. We were planning to have a representative of a business community here. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, that won't be possible, but hopefully we'll be fine. And we should finish by 3:15. We don't want to keep everyone on Zoom for too long. So yeah, let's start. First, I wanted to, before we go into all that, I wanted to invite the director of the Modern Slavery PEC, Mary Hunt, who wanted to say a quick hello and welcome everyone. So Mary, please come on.
Thanks very much indeed, Jakub, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mary Hunt. I'm the director of the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all and thank you for your interest in this event this afternoon and this important subject of consumers, the role of consumers in addressing modern slavery. As Jakub has said in his introductory remarks, the PEC conducts and commissions research which we think has a real chance of driving some transformative change in relation to tackling modern slavery. And we're particularly interested in research about levers which have that potential, but which are currently not very well understood or perhaps are underutilised. So we've done some work, some early work on the role of investors, for example, and the influence that they can have over business behaviour. But we're also very interested in the role of consumers as an underutilised lever in addressing modern slavery. And that's why the Policy and Evidence Centre commissioned the research that you'll be hearing more about today, about the role of consumers and also how, crucially, to move beyond simply raising awareness, and what are the practical steps that are actually required to engage consumers more directly in bringing about some change in business behaviour. The prioritisation of this research by the Policy and Evidence Centre was due in no small part to many conversations we had in the early days of the Policy and Evidence Centre with the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Sara Thornton, who's been a great friend to the Policy and Evidence Centre and is a member of our advisory group. She has a long-standing interest in this area as an area which is underexplored and which needs more work and research to be done to understand it. So it's with a very great pleasure that I hand over to Dame Sara to open the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Murray, and good afternoon, everybody. I have got an interest in this area, and I'll explain why in a minute, but my role, if you're not aware, is a statutory role under the Modern Slavery Act, and it's about identifying good practice around three areas, really, around protecting survivors, prosecuting offences, but also prevention. And that's why I started 2.5 years ago being really interested in terms of the role of consumers. And I remember writing the strategic plan and focusing at that point on consumer awareness. But I think it's fair to say that since I did that at the very beginning, I've become aware, as this research you just published makes clear, that actually it is very complex. So I think in the beginning I thought there's a real role for consumers. I still think that, but I understand the complexity of it. And I remember the earlier report that you'd written, I think was it Consuming Modern Slavery back in 2018, was something that I read, and we were very keen for you to do more work. So it's great that the PEC has funded it. But I think from my very early days of thinking you raise awareness, you change behaviour, I now understand just how much more complex it is. And so really, really welcome this work. And I thought I'd make 3 comments on your findings. The first is that point, which I think is really important, when you say that responsibility must be fairly distributed. And, you know, whether it's investors or consumers, we just need to be very careful about putting huge responsibility on people who aren't equipped to deal with it. I'm not saying they can't, but I am reminded of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that talk about business respects human rights, but the government protects. And so that sense in which, you know, it cannot just be about consumers in the private sector. There is a really important governance and government angle to this. It's something that I completely echo, and really interesting that you made that point. The second point, and it goes back to my kind of journey that I've been on about this is a lot more complicated than I maybe thought it was at first. And the point that you make that actually you can raise awareness, but that doesn't necessarily change behaviour. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. But also that sense is, even if you raise awareness, actually what tangible actions can the consumers take? So I use myself as an example. I know of the problems with hand car washes. I know the problems with nail bars on the high street, but the only action I can really take is avoiding them completely. That maybe is rather a blunt instrument, so a rather blunt response. So that sense in which, of course, there isn't an automatic move from awareness to change behaviour, but also thinking about what exactly are we suggesting that consumers do. And the third point you make, which I think is so pertinent as well, is that of course consumers are not just consumers of goods, or consumers are also citizens. So the extent to which as citizens we can all be contacting politicians, our members of parliament, and raising the issues, and going back to the earlier point about what is the role of government to set the framework, whether it's about Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, whether it's about human rights due diligence, whether it's about import bans. Actually the government has a real role in terms of affecting outcomes. So just to finish by saying I'm really pleased that you've gone on the second kind of chapter of this journey, and I'm pleased with what you say. Of course it's nuanced, of course it's complex, but about a year ago I was talking to an academic who said to me, there's nothing we can do about consumers, and by the way, if you raise awareness, it can make matters worse. And I found that very depressing. But what I took from your report that you've just published is that consumers do create demand, but we need to think about what is good advice, what are the clear objectives of campaigns, and of course we must always evaluate. So thank you for shedding more light on what I think is a really important topic. Handing back to you now, Murray or Jacob. Yes, it's me. Thank you so much, Sara. Very good points that you raise on the awareness. I've been working in the modern slavery sector for quite a few years, and I remember so many campaigns and such a huge focus on raising awareness. And it's good to kind of see how we have to refine our approach beyond that. Yeah, that's very important. Thank you very much for your contribution. Now I'd like to welcome Deirdre Shaw, Professor of Marketing and Consumer Research at the University of Glasgow. Deirdre's work focuses on consumption ethics. She's a member of the research team behind the Modern Slavery PEC project on the role of consumers in addressing modern slavery, and one of the authors of the report. I hope we posted the links to the, I can see that in the chat, where you can access the outputs from the research. Well, for now, you're in luck. You don't have to go and read it now, because Deirdre will present all the key findings and recommendations. So over to you, Deirdre.
Thank you. And thank you for that lovely introduction. Very much appreciated. There should be some slides. Brilliant. Okay, so on behalf of Mikhail, Andreas and I, let me just see if I can move the slides. There we go. We want to very much thank you for this opportunity to share our research today, and for the ongoing support of the Modern Slavery PEC. We'd also very much like to note the support from the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office and Anti-Slavery International. So thank you to Dame Sara and Ryna, who are here today. We very much appreciate your ongoing support of our research, both in this project and in our previous research. So our aim is to understand consumer perspectives of modern slavery. While modern slavery affects many of the products and services we consume as part of our everyday lives, the role of the consumer within modern slavery is not well understood. And we want to position the consumer in their role as both citizen and consumers in supporting efforts to eradicate modern slavery. This is important, as even if unwittingly we play a role in modern slavery through our everyday consumption choices, in effect through demand creation. So we know that action by business can be driven by concerns for reputational damage among their consumers, and that consumer and citizen voice and power is not always collectivized and leveraged effectively. Therefore, it's important to understand how consumer and citizen mobilization towards addressing modern slavery can be supported. So while consumers play an important role in creating demand for cheap products and services, by the same token, they can also play a critical part in exerting pressure for change. So this means positioning the consumer citizen as a key actor in modern slavery, recognizing and understanding their role, and leveraging positive action as part of a collective approach across different stakeholders. So in this research, we were driven by the need to understand the role of consumers in modern slavery and associated action. We examined how consumer attitudes, intentions, and behaviour can be mobilised to address modern slavery, and what interventions are effective in operationalising consumer action on modern slavery. So to achieve this aim, we first of all undertook a comprehensive review of existing academic research in the area of modern slavery and consumption, as well as the broader area of consumption ethics. And the purpose was to examine research that investigates actual behaviour and gaps between stated attitudes, intentions and behaviours. And second, we undertook a comprehensive review of academic research into anti-trafficking and anti-slavery campaigns to identify common methods and outcomes. And then thirdly, we identified and analysed case studies of real-world interventions that attempt to mobilise the consumer in relation to instances of modern slavery. Then we undertook expert interviews with key individuals from those case studies, and this enabled the identification of further criteria in relation to effective campaigns and policy that can mobilise the consumer. So as you'd expect, we have a number of key findings, but in the interest of time today, I'd like to highlight 3 key areas. So it's vital that campaigns not only raise awareness, as we've just heard, but identify clear actions that consumers can take. It can be frustrating and confusing to have your awareness raised, but then not have pathways to positive action that you can take. It's also important to consider that pathways to action can be different for different people, and not to consider that one approach will work for everyone. It's also important to recognise that consumers are also citizens, and that actions they take are not restricted to decisions to buy or not to buy, but also citizen actions such as petitioning and other forms of voice. It can be the combination of such actions that may be an important lever to change, given their ability to seek responses across different stakeholder groups. And thirdly, it's important to not solely responsibilise consumers, but to recognise their responsibility alongside other stakeholders. So action is taken across different stakeholders and balanced accordingly, recognising, for example, different levels of power, influence and effectiveness among different stakeholder groups. So an important outcome from the research is offering practical recommendations in terms of developing effective campaigns that can target consumers. So again, here we have a range of recommendations in our full report, but for now I'll identify insights for application focused on understanding the consumer, use of marketing principles and consideration of wider consequences. So first, in terms of the consumer, it's important to consider what level of involvement is required from consumers. So the lower consumers' involvement, and by this I mean, for example, purchasing of small items such as food, like chocolate, then the higher need for clear and credible labelling that can act as a shortcut and providing visual clues that enable easy action without having to consider full kind of research and evaluation around that product. And then conversely, where there's a higher level of involvement required, such as buying a larger item like a computer, or for example, engaging in writing letters to brands as part of citizen action, then there's a stronger need for communicating clear pathways to action. It's also, in terms of the consumer, important to consider the barriers blocking consumer action. So any modern slavery campaign needs to carefully consider such barriers. These can be contextual, for example, the availability of opportunities to take action in a consumer's everyday environment, or constraints linked to time, financial resources, and psychosocial, such as the commonplace view that a single symbolic act won't make much difference. And then second, marketing principles such as segmentation and targeting, branding, advertising and communication should be engaged to support campaigns in informing, persuading, motivating and mobilising consumer action. And these need to be implemented through design, development and also evaluation of modern slavery campaigns. So this means that modern slavery campaigns need to be strategically tailored and targeted to the most appropriate audiences with the ability to act. Communication needs to focus on shifting norms, as consumption is fundamentally an habitual domain, that can be difficult to change. So the voices of people affected by modern slavery or credible influencers can play a key role in unsettling, often taken for granted behaviours. So these credible influencers need to be strategically identified prior to campaign launch. And then third, attempts to mobilise the consumer work best when they're part of a multi-pronged, multi-stakeholder strategy that aims to build coalitions among, for example, workers, NGOs, businesses, investors, government, regulatory bodies, and consumers themselves. So this multi-stakeholder approach is essential both in terms of collectivising the voice of the consumer and harnessing their power in effecting change, but also because consumers themselves need to feel that their actions are part of a more holistic approach, as opposed to a way of shouldering the responsibilities of other actors. It's also important to consider the possibility of any potentially harmful unintended consequences prior to campaign launch. Worryingly common, these may include stereotyping and reinforcement of harmful assumptions, unhelpful stigmatization, oversimplification of complicated contexts, and consumer confusion. So, not surprisingly, when you engage in a piece of research, you come up with answers, but also more questions. And this was a relatively small pilot project, so part of our aim was to set recommendations for further work that we felt was required. So while our research very much highlighted that the consumer can be an important stakeholder in eradicating modern slavery, further insights are needed as to how to effectively harness consumer action. So our recommendations include the need for further research into modern slavery campaigns and how messages are framed to identify the most effective communication approaches and their effectiveness across time and under different conditions. Research is needed to also identify and guide effective consumer pathways to action, as these currently don't exist. We found limited research that measures actual behaviour undertaken by consumers. So more research is needed that includes measures or observations of actual consumer and citizen behaviour. And campaign evaluation is important to maximise the effectiveness of campaigns and build to identify ways to build as opposed to the danger of depleting citizen consumer enthusiasm, and we would benefit from understanding this more clearly. And as a final point, consumers are concerned about a range of different issues and they may act on only some of these issues. So it's important to position modern slavery within the context of these wider concerns and the broader political and institutional systems involved. So here is the link, I think this is in the chat as well, to our report. So there's the full report, there's the research summary, there's a guide for practitioners, and also from that there's the blog and a podcast. And as was mentioned earlier, here's the link to the original piece of research that we started in this area. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. That was a great introduction to the discussion. We're about to have a lot of food for thought for our discussion, and I think especially the point on kind of looking at wider context and wider kind of groups of stakeholders and different groups that we need to think about in order to push the conversation forward is quite important. And I'm glad to have the panelists from different areas of practice. Let's move on to the panel discussion then. Just to say, we will have a Q&A session at the end. Everyone will be able to ask questions, so feel free to post some in the chat, and later we'll be able to turn the video on for those of you who want to do that. But we would like to start by giving the voice to our speakers. First, we asked our speakers for 3 minutes presentation to use the 3 minutes to answer the question that we asked them. being based on your experience, how do you see the role of consumers in addressing modern slavery, and what is the most important thing in engaging them in this context? And I would like to start with Aja Barber, who is a writer, stylist, and consultant, whose work deals with the intersection of sustainability and the fashion landscape. Her work builds heavily on ideas behind privilege, wealth inequality, racism, feminism, colonialism, and how to fix the fashion industry with all these things in mind. She's the author of the book entitled Consumed: The Need for Collective Change, Colonialism, Climate Change, and Consumerism. She is also quite active on Instagram. Some of you might know her from there. Welcome, Aja. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you for having me. Hi, my name's Aja, and I am the author of this book. And I guess the first thing I would say is the role of the citizen is definitely changing as people sort of awaken to this idea that maybe the systems that we participate in are a faulty bill of goods. And I think we've become a little bit more polarized as citizens personally during the global pandemic. I think when the world went into lockdown, what we had a polarization of people. The person who was already starting to think about these things and maybe not feeling so comfy going, oh yes, I'll just go shopping to make myself happy and buy a bunch of stuff. That person took whatever lockdown situation they were in to dive deeper into the material, to think longer about it, and to also realize that, hello, it's winter, I'm not seeing anyone, I can actually just wear two outfits for the entire week and no one will ever know. Like that was a big thing that came out of lockdown. However, people that really weren't thinking about these topics at all and weren't trying to really consider it, I think went even deeper into consumerism. It was, I'm freaking out, this is very scary, you know, I don't get to have all the comforts that I'm used to, which is seeing family, friends, going out at night, socializing. And so what do? I buy myself a lot of stuff, hence the rise of, you know, a website called Shein. You know, that is the website that is trouncing all of the other fast fashion that might be a little higher priced, particularly those that also have brick and mortar, because they just skirt around those rules. And so you're seeing basically people go in one of two ways, but the awareness is there, in my opinion, like it has never been before. As someone who always kind of felt a little bit weird about fast fashion, but couldn't really put my finger on why I felt that way, I was bringing up this subject matter as early as 2012 and really sort of hitting a brick wall with a lot of my peers where no one really wanted to see it. And that today has completely changed. The conversation has completely changed. I think that there was this very weird lack of empathy and sort of out of sight, out of mind. And maybe the conversation has come to the forefront because we have an opportunity with the climate crisis to really actually rebuild a lot of systems. There are a lot of systems that are just full of loopholes to exploit other people, where we're going to either keep going the way we're going and run ourselves and the planet into the ground, or we're going to fix these issues. And so I think with what we are understanding of what's going to happen with the climate crisis, people are actually starting to really put some skin in the game. And so, you know, the role of the citizen, in my opinion, is to really, you know, make the best decision that you possibly can with the tools at your disposal. And it's going to look different for every person. However, you know, as someone who came from the United States but now lives in the UK, I have seen a lot of my peers making decisions where perhaps there was another choice and we just kind of went along with it because of peer pressure or whatever. So we're starting to sort of get to this place where we're talking about all of these systems that we've all played into with honesty for the first time. And with that honesty comes an acknowledgement that we can't ignore anymore how these systems harm other people. And also a realistic viewpoint of, does this actually even make us happy? You know, it sure is rising our credit card debt, you know, but no one's getting happier in this system. Certainly not the people making the clothes, my God, but maybe not us either. And so I do feel like there is a different awareness that I've never felt before. But, you know, as the last presenter said, the communication that needs to be there, the confusion that happens with citizens, that's what I aim to clarify on my platform. Because one of the big things that I see brands do is they'll say, we stand against modern slavery on their website, but that is not the same thing as ensuring that every single person that makes your clothing is paid a living and good wage, not even just a living wage, a wage where they can actually have a life, you know, life where they can build, where they can feed their family, where they can, you know, dream about different things. And that's the problem, is that brands have been really sort of allowed to say and do whatever they want, regardless of whether there is truth behind it. And when we have that sort of world, then everyone's just going to be confused, throw their hands up and go, well, I can't really change it, so what does it matter? And so I work on my platform to get people to understand that there's a lot of tricky language being used, and here's how you cut through it. Now, with the conversation surrounding sustainability and ethical and this and that, we all want it all at once. So the first thing I tell people is, if you're looking to support a new business, instead of looking for sustainability credentials, look to see if this business ever says that every single person who makes their clothing is paid a living and fair wage. Put that above sustainability, because at the end of the day, the biggest problem I see is overconsumption and scale, right? Brands that pay people fairly and justly usually don't have the same margins to overproduce, because you just don't have that money, because surprise, you're putting it into other humans and treating humans fairly. So I tell people, you know, if you were looking to start from the very, very beginning of all of this and you don't know where to go, look for the fair wages. And if they are not saying in very clear language, we can ensure that every person is being paid a fair wage, then assume that they are not sure of that. And so for me, I work online to help people parse through some of the unclear language, which is used to obscure the fact that many of these brands have no idea if there is modern slavery within their supply chain. Thank
you, Aja. That's great to have you open in so much depth. We'll for sure hear from you more. Can we? I would like to go to Ryna now. Ryna Sherazi is the head of fundraising and communications at Anti-Slavery International. For those of you who don't know, Anti-Slavery International is the oldest human rights organization in the world. It's working to realize freedom from slavery for everyone, everywhere, and always. So it's working to end modern slavery in all its forms. Anti-slavery has worked on many campaigns involving consumers to put pressure on businesses and governments to address modern slavery in global supply chains, and is continuing to do so. So over to you, Ryna.
Thanks, Jakob, and thanks to all the speakers that have gone before. Some real food for thought already, even before we've got into the crux of the conversation. So at Anti-Slavery International, we're really looking at this through the lens of the practitioner, campaigner. You know, how do we, you know, play a role in mobilising that community of people that will take the action that leads to the desired change. And I think the first thing I would say about that question that you've posed to us is, well, I'm deconstructing it, to be honest, Jakob, is there isn't one homogenous set of consumers, as the research very clearly tells us. You know, how we engage with, well, just very simply, you know, a Gen Z consumer to a boomer consumer will be very different. Now they use their time and have available time to be able to find out more about their consumption choices will be very, very different. So, you know, as an NGO worker responsible for engaging people in the organisation's issue, in the broader issues of modern slavery and responsible consumption to some extent, I see the role of individual action, some of which is incorporates the role of a consumer, but also the role of an activist and the role of a supporter, for example, as a critical one. But it's a critical one within the suite of overall pressure points that we can push. And so, you know, knowing that there's a body of the public, in this case, in this conversation, consumer citizens, that can, through their consumption habits, choices, potentially make or break a demand in a product or a service, principally. And if we are doing our job properly and we are making the connections between the positive impact that a change in behaviour can create, then we are doing our jobs properly. Now, big caveat, as a practitioner, and this is not at all you know, unique to the modern slavery sector at all. You know, I've worked in other, particularly internationally, in other sectors. What we tend to find, and the research, you know, certainly demonstrates this and articulates probably better than I can, is that despite this critical role that consumers and individuals play within, you know, the overall kind of levers, the drivers needed to create the change, actually what happens in the design of campaigns internally within you know, activist organisations is that quite often those consumers, those individuals, are sort of the last thought. They're a bit of the kind of afterthought after the message, after the, you know, the policy target, and so I'm not surprised to see some of the findings of the research, because what we haven't been doing necessarily as well as we could be, and there's lots and lots of reasons for that. A lot of it is because of, you know, short-term planning, because of short-term funding, for example, is actually putting the values, principles, motivations and behaviours of those consumers at the centre of what it is that we want to change, and that's what I'm really hopeful about. I'm extremely, as Jakob knows, extremely passionate about us being able to shift, and I think this research is a really seminal point in that shift. But what I want to say very quickly is, you know, if we don't take this seriously, if we don't take the recommendations of the research seriously, and indeed, in my opinion, you know, put funding behind even more research into this area, then we, as a sector, there is a significant danger that we will be contributing towards campaigner fatigue, that will be, you know, we're being very extractive potentially with, you know, telling our campaigning audiences how to buy, what to do, but not necessarily showing them the change that ultimately makes, the role that they have in that change, and being realistic about the fact that it takes a very long time and it requires, as the research says, many stakeholders. So I suppose from my perspective, in terms of what's important about engaging those consumers or consumer citizens, is that we move much more rapidly to a practice that is focused on dialogue with those individuals, not monologues. And, you know, I should say there's some really brilliant developments over the last 2 years in terms of, you know, really understanding that consumer motivations much better. Focus less on what we're asking people to do, less on the action at the moment, and before we ask that question of ourselves, ask ourselves as the campaign designers, if you like, why is it that those consumers should care? What is the values, you know, overlap that we need to sort of attract more and more people to our movement with. And after that comes the set of actions, the pathways, as the research identifies. And then third, you know, obviously, as we said before, it's more than, you know, we are more than the sum of what we buy. We're more than, you know, our credit card statement. And what I'd really like to encourage practitioners here today to think about is, when we are designing campaigns collectively, some brilliant work happening across the sector in coalition at the moment, is to think about those consumers in terms of the voice that they can contribute towards the change we want to see, the time they can contribute. And let's remember that we are generationally moving to a point where people are becoming even more time poor, significantly more time poor than my parents, for example. And then the third action that we want them to focus on, which is how do they contribute their money? So that's, you know, how they buy, their purchasing power and decisions, but also where are they putting their money in terms of, you know, their philanthropy. And that actually has a loop back to voice, because if you feel good about what you're contributing to, you're much more likely to talk to your friends and family about it. And actually our research, you know, Anti-Slavery International is very much showing that we've got very, very high percentages of people actually feeling good about contributing towards this change, and therefore they want to tell others about it, which is, you know, a brilliant situation to be in. So you know, lots for us to kind of focus on, but I think, you know, some really great great indicators from this research in terms of the practical steps that we can take as practitioners. So it's a bit more than 3 minutes.
I'll give you a pass on this one. Thank you, Ryna, very much. I wanted to move on to Andreas. Professor Andreas Chassidakis is from Royal Holloway University. He's interested in the intersection of consumption with ethics and politics. He's working on projects such as consumer-oriented activism and the role of care and relationality in everyday consumption. He's also the member of the research team behind the research that we're discussing today. Andreas.
Right. Thank you, Jakob. So I'll try not to repeat some of the excellent points that have been made already. And I'll try to be brief. So when it comes to thinking the role of the consumer, I think Ryna already nailed it. We have to think of the role of the consumer within a multi-stakeholder framework. We have to think of consumers as actors in a, you know, as Sara said, rather complicated context, right? And we have to think creatively and strategically in terms of engaging consumers. And what I mean by that is consumers are not just those that buy or not buy products and services on the basis of, you know, extreme labor exploitation, but also those that can write to corporations. We know, for example, from previous research that even writing a letter to a retailer such as, I don't know, Tesco or Sainsbury's can initiate an investigative process, right? And that is a very important role we can still play within the marketplace, but we can also play so many different roles outside of the marketplace. And that's where we are not only consumers, but also citizens, students, activists, and so on and so forth. So we really need to think of, you know, our role as consumers, you know, rather expansively, if we really want to be effective. But also I wanted to say one thing in terms of engagement, and I don't want to repeat, Dietrich has already, you know, summarized many of our key points, so I don't want to reiterate them all here. But one thing I would like to emphasize is that, you know, when we think of consumers, it's very easy to fall into, you know, the assumption that consumers engage in individual action, right? Consumers can also engage in collective action, right? And this is very important for a variety of reasons. One of them being that, you know, Ryna said, why should we care? One thing we have to counter-propose is more meaningful, more fun, and even if you like, more sexy ways of caring and doing consumer activism. And that can only come through social relationships. This is how our life becomes meaningful. And we really have to address this as a key part of the consumer activism context, if you like. I was listening to a podcast where Asa was talking, and she was talking, you know, Asa mentioned something that I think is was very spot on. One of the most sustainable things we can do, and ethical things, is to use those clothes that are already in our wardrobe, right? And one thing I wanted to bring in here as an example is one of the spaces I'm fascinated with in Athens, where consumers have collectively rented a space where they go and give or take, or give and take various different goods such as clothes, but also services, right? Without any norms of reciprocity. So in addition to, you know, using as much as they can from their own wardrobe, they actually meet and share things there and then, right? And that is not important only in terms of sustainability and ethics. It's also important in terms of making this fun, developing new social relationships, right? And I think that is a key, very important in terms of consumer activism. And actually in our research, we also got a hint as to why this is important, because many of our successful campaigns were those that didn't target consumers necessarily, but those that relied on specific groups of students, religious and activist groups, and so on and so forth. So even within the modern slavery context, we could see how, the notion of collective action, in addition to individual action, is very important. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We've got even more food for thought. I'm not quite sure where to start, but let's move on to the kind of Aja. Did you want to come in and respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I have seen on my platform real impact of social media backlash for brands. There was a particular case where a brand was exaggerating the claims that a recent report had come up with in regards to sustainability. And the post that they wrote was extremely misleading to the general public. And so a bunch of us with platforms just started spamming the post. There were blog posts written about how they were misleading the general public. As a result of that, the brand had to publicly apologize and say, oh, we got so excited, but maybe we still have work to do. And that's the type of thing that I did not see happen 5, 6, 7 years ago. It would be anything a brand said was just, okay, well, that's fine. Where because there was this outcry, they ended up having to apologize. The organization that had written the report had to say, they've misled you on this. And so there is an interest there. And when there is an interest and when there is a collective, we might be acting as individuals, but together it becomes a tidal wave.
No, that is great, and I guess you're touching on something that I think I wanted to get out of the way in a way first, and that is the responsibility of consumers, because that's one of the kind of first points that the research is raising. And on one hand, the research says, okay, we shouldn't blame the consumers for modern slavery, but equally we shouldn't. We should make them co-responsible for addressing it. And I wanted to ask you all, to what extent do you think consumers are responsible for addressing modern slavery, and how far we can kind of stretch that responsibility? Because there are many voices, I'm aware, that kind of feel slightly uneasy about it because well, I'm not, as a consumer, guilty of I'm not responsible for modern slavery in the supply chains. Why should I care? Who wants to start? Andreas, go on.
Yeah, I think it is indeed a very fine balance, that we are talking about here, right? There has to be a sense of proportionality and fairness in terms of what we ask consumers to do, right? And we have to be very careful in terms of, not employing, totalizing explanations as to why we should or we should not mobilize the consumers. Of course, some people argue, the neoliberal system is such that it relies on individual consumers to shoulder all sorts of different responsibilities, and this is wrong, and therefore we should not ask consumers to do anything. And okay, point taken. But equally, what we argue in the report is we cannot fully de-responsibilize consumers either. Consumers do have a role to play beyond neoliberalism and such explanations. We don't want scandals such as the book one, right, to go past thoroughly unnoted by consumers, right? Consumers have power, and the question is, how can we leverage that power? How can we collectivize it without, of course, making consumers feel primarily responsible, right? We know that too well, yeah? But equally, we cannot assume that consumers are naive, or by campaigning on something on modern slavery, they do not understand that what they are also against is a systemic issue of worker exploitation. I don't think consumers are that naive, and we should not be patronizing in that sense either. Yeah.
Thank you, Andreas. I think Dean Sara wanted to come in on that.
Jacob, if I can, and I think Andreas talked about kind of proportionality on this. The evidence seems to me clear that consumers have influence, but they're just one of many stakeholders, and we must not put too much pressure on them. And thinking of an example where I think there are unrealistic expectations might be the current approach to modern slavery statements under Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. This idea that if businesses are all required to write modern slavery statements and they upload them onto the government registry, the idea that consumers will look through these complex statements and make a decision about whether to buy X product or Y product, I think is just expecting far too much. My view is that the legislation actually made provision for the government to take action for businesses that hadn't written modern slavery statements. The government have never used those powers. So for me, that's a good example of unrealistic expectation on the consumer on what is a role really for the state to undertake.
Yeah, that is a very good point, and that kind of draws the complexity of the picture that we have to deal with. Ryna or Aja, did you want to come in on this?
I don't think I have anything new to add, but when I think about, and I've moved a lot actually in my time in the modern slavery sector, from yes, you know, in some areas there's definitely been some really interesting kind of consumer action, and it does absolutely relate to that kind of like the social commodity side of consuming, you know, but the more and more we work on responsible business and Anti-Slavery International, the more potentially by focusing too heavily on the role of consumers, we're letting companies and actually governments off the hook. And you know, I often seek out the parallel with, say, recycling, for example. You know, recycling hasn't stopped us consuming more, even though we see, like we in my house, you know, 2 boxes of recycling go out every day, which is awful. And you know, it's not necessarily changing my habits, and actually, is it really making a difference in terms of, you know, climate change and reduction in plastic use and all the rest of it? Very much doubt it. So, you know, I think we have to be very careful it just doesn't become a bit of a sort of panacea for actually, you know, really targeting what are the changes.
I definitely think, obviously, we need the regulation, we need the government involved. People, I always say at the top of a food chain where there's a billionaire, blame the billionaire first. But I definitely think as citizens, we have to care about other people. And as far as the system of fast fashion has gone, there has been a lot of looking the other way on things that we know cannot possibly be fair or right. A conversation I used to have very early into all of this, you know, I would say, yeah, I don't know if I can really buy from that brand because they did get, you know, caught up in sweatshop stuff. And, you know, one of the things that I commonly hear people say, which is just a general lack of empathy, is, well, you know, it's a good job in that country. And I always challenge that notion because I always hit back with, okay, but would you want to do that job? Would you want your child to do that job? Would you feel okay with your neighbor doing that job? Then why do you feel comfortable with saying that it's okay for that person over there? There's a lot of unpicking that needs to happen between how we have viewed people in countries that are, you know, less economically advantaged. And I think because of these pernicious attitudes towards people who might live far away from us and aren't our neighbors and friends, there can sometimes be a lack of empathy behind the justification of why we buy. I mean, the average fast fashion consumer in the US buys 68 clothing items a year. We can't say that that's need-based buying, but we do know that the system can only move as fast as it possibly does because of exploitation of others. And so it's time to be extremely realistic, especially with the ways in which the conversation surrounding, you know, progressive topics like intersectional feminism goes. You know, we can't be wearing t-shirts that say feminist on it that were made in a sweatshop. Are you kidding me? And so while I am very aware that we need the regulation, we need the government, we need to make sure that like these companies are paying for what they've done, there needs to be a recognition of empathy that also happens where we start really investigating what role we're playing here, and do we have to play that role? Do you have to be that person that looks the other way on the $5 t-shirt when you already have 5 t-shirts that you don't wear at home that you can possibly wear? And so I think it's all parts, but in order to really, my feeling personally, and you know, feel free to fight me on this, I feel like if we want the momentum where the government cannot possibly ignore this stuff anymore, we have to have a change in our society and how we view these things. It has to be socially unacceptable to say that's a good job in that country when it's not a job that any of us would ever want to do.
Thank you. I think that leads me nicely into a question that is actually touching on 3 things. So one, awareness raising. I think what struck me, for example, in your book, Aja, is that the kind of way to your activism and to writing your book start with kind of educating yourself. So on the issue and on how fast fashion works. So there is clearly a role for awareness raising in engaging consumers. But then the research comes up with the kind of major recommendation: just don't only raise awareness. You have to identify actions that consumers can take. And finally, in that context, in this, what action to take is treat consumers as citizens. So I wanted to ask you and kind of think about that, and maybe kind of think of potential practical actions that you see for consumers do in this context, where kind of our engagement of consumers can go. And just before you answer, I wanted to say that we are looking at our chat and we will move to some questions after this. So please feel free to post some questions in the chat. So who would like to come first with how do you see the role of engagement of consumers as citizens and in the context of kind of moving away from awareness raising? Andreas.
Yeah, just to clarify, because when we are saying awareness raising is not enough, we are saying this within the context of individual campaigns, right? Because as I made a point earlier, which is very, very fair, I mean, of course, raising awareness and knowledge around these issues is of utmost significance, right? We need to change the debate. We need to generate that discourse at a broader level, where people are actually concerned about things such as, you know, worker exploitation, environmental exploitation, and so on and so forth, right? So of course awareness is important, and sometimes we have to stop at awareness. But at the context of individual campaigns, it is where we have to also think of more specific pathways to action, right? And, you know, those pathways to action, you know, can be very, very diverse. And actually, if I may jump in and answer the first question, which was about public procurement, for example, right? You know, there we know that one pathway to awareness would be to, you know, collectivize consumer power or opinion around a specific issue with a view to push institutional buyers to make, you know, more ethical choices. You know, that is a pathway to action as well, right? And that is what Imokali Tomatoes, the Fair Food campaign, tried to do to some extent. In the context of public procurement, we did make the point that consumers, in the way of feeling that a sense of proportionality is applied, it would be a good idea to, you know, have you know, public bodies producing modern slavery statements as well, for example, right? And again, we can see how, you know, awareness then is, you know, the first step in a process that is, you know, following through strategic, you know, logics as to, you know, what can be achieved and, you know, at what level.
Would anyone else like to come in on that, on the kind of moving away from awareness raising and moving into practical action as citizens?
Can I just say something very quickly? And this also relates to Izzy's question about how we engage those consumers that don't have current awareness and understanding of modern slavery. I think, like with everything, we've got to be able to see this on the continuum. Of course, you know, there will be people who have been engaged in this issue and can take actions and have the time and have the lifestyle that means that actually this is something that, you know, they have got time to act upon this issue because they care about it. But then, and going back to Aja's point, it's raising awareness for what? It's raising awareness so that people care about other people who are going through this horrific suffering in a lot of cases. And I find myself reflecting a lot on what the pandemic did to us in our neighbourhoods, right? Do we all have a slightly better understanding of the well-being of our neighbours now than we did 2 years ago? Probably for a lot of people that is the case, and it was something like the pandemic that we were out of control of that helped us to do that. And as campaigners, what we can do is to start putting a conversation on the table that will allow anyone who, again, has can adhere to the values that I hope that we all can around making sure that people are being treated well and fairly, can understand a little bit more about this issue, to either now do something about that or in time, because most of us are still, actually, even those of us who consider ourselves experts in this, are still on a journey of action and contributing towards the issue of tackling modern slavery. So I think it's really important, almost as a pipeline of action, activists, campaigners, collaborators.
Just one brief observation, if I may, Jacob. One of the issues about consumers acting together as citizens to put pressure on government, I think, I completely agree, it can be very powerful, and the climate and environmental issues show how it can be. But I'm not sure we're always clear about what the ask is. So if we want people to be putting pressure as citizens on their politicians, what are these simple asks? And I think some clarity about that and the way in which the sector can help develop those. I was thinking, as I was just listening, think about the way in the UK, what's they called? Is it Surfers Against Sewage? You've just been brilliant at mounting the campaign to force the government to stop the Environment Agency just tipping sewage into the sea when there's a lot of rain. And it's kind of a very simple message. You must stop doing this because it's very unpleasant surfing and swimming in the sea that's polluted like this. So for me, it just illustrates, what are the 2 or 3 things that we might be wanting to help people to act and mobilise as citizens. And sometimes I'm not sure we're that clear. I mean, I love Aj's points about the textile and fashion industry. I saw a diagram of a t-shirt, and Aj, I'm sure you must have seen it, which said that for a £25 t-shirt that's sold, in a decent shop in this country, made in Bangladesh, 15 pence goes to the workers. 15 pence to £25. Now, I don't think most people understand that. But but then what is the ask? You raise awareness, but what do we want politicians to do about that, I guess?
Exactly. It feels like we're just not there. And that was partly my question. Are there any kind of practical ways that you kind of see developing that in the role as citizens and kind of going beyond that? Because I mean, another kind of thing that comes into it that Deirdre kind of presented is the framing of the modern slavery. And I think some raise, for example, that part of that is that modern slavery is a very narrow approach. And kind of exclude the view that modern slavery is kind of on the spectrum of exploitation of exploitative practices that kind of go beyond that. So kind of, do you see any kind of ways of getting out of that narrative, Aja?
So, I always try and educate people to look at what is currently being proposed and where there is room for us to grow with something that's being proposed and look at it as how do we fix this loophole as well. So one of the things that interests me is, for instance, like the minimum corporate tax that is being pushed by Secretary Janet Yellen. I think that there's really good opportunities. This is in the States, obviously, I'm in the UK. I think that there's very good opportunities within that to end the race to the bottom, which is what we talk about when we talk about how the workers will make 15 cents on a tea, that 15 pence on a tea that costs 20 pounds. I think that there are opportunities for further legislation within something like that to be written in order to make sure that, companies in the US aren't going overseas and exploiting people. If we're going to have to pay a tax to go overseas, how do we put additional guidelines in that framework to make sure that when companies do go overseas, they are treating people fairly and behaving accordingly? So I tend to sort of point these things out to people so that they can sort of see, well, what's happening here? How do we use column A to also work with column B in a way that is copacetic? So.
Thank you, Aja. Is there anyone else? I wanted also to go to the questions. Andreas, did you want to come in? And after that, maybe we can answer some questions from the chat then.
Yeah, just very briefly, I totally agree. I think there is space for better citizen-oriented campaigns than what we have. I mean, there are some, for example, by Freedom United and so on, so for that goal, citizens to petition for things, but of course there is space for more or collective action than what we already have. But also there is more space for alliances, right? And that's where Anti-Slavery International comes in, and we have other contexts where consumers have very successfully worked with NGOs, for example, in the context of fair trade procurement, right? To achieve outcomes such as fair trade procurement at institutional levels, right? So it's definitely an area worthy of further contemplation, if you like, in that sense, and action.
Thank you, Andreas. So that was partly the answer to the question from Lizzie about the links across the taking action in relation to racism, climate change, feminism, and modern slavery, and about building coalition. Would anyone else like to come in on that?
Yeah, just to say, you asked a question earlier about kind of practical changes, is that there is, I don't know if anyone from CJC is here, some really brilliant work underway by the team at CJC on work on it's primarily business action, but intersects with a whole range of different issues. And I think there's some superb learning from a lot of work that's happened, particularly in the last sort of year, 18 months, that CJC has led. And as we've had a year in this country, at least, of lots of international decision-making meetings, and that's really kind of come to the fore. So I think there's some brilliant learning that I really hope will be, disseminated across the sector at the end of this year to help practitioners to understand how that kind of coalition working can build very, very well, but also brought in quite a lot of marketing principles that Andreas's team talks about as well. Can I just say one other thing about kind of collective orientations, because there's the collective that that we can be, right, as practitioners, as professionals. But at Anti-Slavery International, we've been doing quite a lot of research across the audiences that we work. So that's campaigners that take part in our campaign actions, that's supporters, that's members, that's volunteers, and so on. And there's a couple of things that I think are really, really noticeable for this debate, and one of them is that the supporters that we surveyed in our samples were showing a 44% likelihood, or at least 44% of them recorded talking passionately to their friends and family about their interest in supporting a modern slavery, anti-modern slavery organisation. Now, for any marketeers here, you'll know that in most organisations are around a 4 to 5%. Most people will kind of support. It's a personal thing. They don't really talk about it because it's like their own personal financial contribution to something or campaigning contribution. 44%. Let's say if that's the case for all modern slavery activists, those people who take part in support actions, that's enormous, and we're really missing out potentially on that peer-to-peer influencing, which with social media could be done exceptionally well. So a huge opportunity there. But the other thing in terms of collective orientations that the research also talks about is that year after year after year, when we've surveyed our audiences, one of the main reasons they say that they take part in a campaign action outside of helping to create a change is that they're doing it collectively. They're doing it not as because they know that individually they will make a difference, but that they know that there is a body other people that with that momentum together that they can change something. And that has been, you know, consistent data that we've had from those audiences. Again, I think a real sign of hope, because I think this sector does that well. We just need to, as Sarah says, get to that point of like being much clearer and much more realistic about what the actual ask is.
Jacob, can I pick up on Erin's question, which is linked to investments, because we talked about sort of political citizenship, but there's the other issue about how, as investors, people can put pressure on business. And of course, there's the work that the CCLA does, and Rathbones, Votes Against Slavery, those sorts of big organisational issues. But because I'm old, I have a financial advisor. And I was talking to him a few months ago, and he was saying to me, from next year, when he's reviewing kind of the money that we've got saved for my old age, that one of the conversations he has to have is about the ethical issues about where it's invested. And that's me as a very small investor in unit trusts. Now, I think the question that is prompted in my mind is that an opportunity? If there are lots of people having those sort of conversations, you know, up and down the country, do we have a position about what sort of questions? Do we have a view about what people should be saying? What should I say to him about which sort of stocks and shares I want him to be investing? We don't want him, I hope he doesn't invest in sin stocks or whatever they call them, but, you know, is there something more nuanced and complex that maybe ASI and different people can say, actually, there's a whole load of people, Joe Average is going to be having this conversation. How can we equip them to use that opportunity for good?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think, unfortunately, we reached the time, and thank you very much for all your contributions, and thank you very much for everyone's question. I don't think we managed to go through all of the questions, but I think we addressed most of the points, I hope. I think the kind of major message that I'm getting, and the collective head nodding was the greatest when about the points when we kind of have to get together and work together and bring in people from all ways of areas of work against modern slavery to kind of work together, connect those dots, and bringing consumers into the whole picture as well. Thank you so much to all the speakers for your contributions, and thank you very much to everyone from the audience for your questions and for listening. Just to reiterate, you can find the research on our website at modernslaverypec.org. There is a full report, there is a short summary, there is a guidance for practitioners if there are any interested in engaging consumers and using it effectively. There is also a podcast where we talk with the whole research team. And yeah, thank you so much for all your contributions. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.